Welcome to China Considered, a podcast that brings fresh insights and informed discussion to one of the most consequential issues of our time, how China is changing and changing the world. I'm Liz Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-director of the U.S., China, and the World program at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today, I have with me Matt Turpin. Matt is currently a senior advisor at Palantir and a visiting fellow at Hoover, where he produces one of the best Substacks on China that you will find, China Articles. But he spent most of his career in service of our country, first in the U.S. Army and then in a number of senior positions at the Pentagon, followed by the Commerce Department and National Security Council. Matt, it's great to have you with us.
Well, Liz, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, Matt, I want to take you back to the beginning. You graduated from West Point in the mid-1990s. It was a time in the U.S.-China relationship that was relatively good until it wasn't. Secretary of Defense Bill Perry was all about opening up mill-to-mill relations at the time. I think there was a lot of positive energy in the relationship. And then, boom, we had the Taiwan Strait crisis, 95, 96, where China was lobbing missiles into the Taiwan Strait, trying to deter the Taiwanese and meddle in their first ever actually directly elected presidential election. So how did all of that influence your thinking? So when you came out of West Point, what was your orientation on China?
So to be honest, it was absolutely zero orientation on China. I came out of the academy having been a European history major. I had no conception that I'd really spend a time thinking about things at the sort of strategic level. I was focused on being an armor second lieutenant, and I went out to Fort Irwin, California, where I played laser tag on tanks for almost 4 years. So from like January of 1996 through the end of 1999. I was focused on doing war games for the U.S. Army at the very tactical level. I lived outside on a tank in the desert 2 weeks out of every month for nearly 4 years. I had almost no conception of what was happening in the broader world. I felt very focused on what I was doing then and there. And it just kind of goes to show that like folks that are in the Army really oftentimes are not really tracking what's happening at the geopolitical level. You're really focused on the day-to-day of how do you have your units well trained, and focus on sort of learning your job.
And so even at West Point itself, there wasn't a kind of education around one of the major emerging great powers of our time that sort of shaped.
Yeah. It
In,
would have been nice.
in
I didn't. I am absolutely. I mean, we certainly had folks that took Chinese. I did not take Chinese. I originally took Arabic, because if you'll remember, I came to West Point in 1991.
uh,
And so if you were like looking at the world then, Arabic seems like a really interesting language to learn. I did really poorly at Arabic. And my advisors and counselors at West Point advised that I move back to a more simple language, and so I took French.
like English? No,
Well, in English as well. I often joke that I graduated in the top 5% of the bottom half of my class
There
at
you
West
go.
Point, and so I was not particularly focused on the academic side of this, and to be perfectly honest, I felt that I was a European history major. I spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the history and politics of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's what I spent my time sort of working on from an academic perspective. I ended up going back to graduate school after my time as a lieutenant and as a captain. I focused on American history at UNC Chapel Hill. I went back to West Point and taught in the history department. So I sort of did all of that through about 2006 before I went back out to the Army. And I didn't actually start really working on China or even Asia issues until I chose to take an assignment at Pacific Command in Hawaii in 2010. So up until that point, I mean, to be perfectly honest, my focus was on other parts of the world, and was really focused on my sort of career as an Army officer and how to lead America's sons and daughters, at a variety of different places around the world. And so, China was always in the back of my mind, but it was not particularly forefront, at least for me. And so when I moved to Indo-PACOM, essentially that was the same time that you have, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, writing a piece in Foreign Affairs about a pivot to Asia. And so it was opportune, but it was not planned by me. I only picked Hawaii because it seemed like a much better assignment than the other ones that were available.
Right. Right, and it turned out to be prescient, but I take
Yes,
your point, but
but
it
yeah,
wasn't
not
planned.
an effort by me, but
Right.
purely by chance.
It was serendipitous.
Serendipity. Yeah.
Okay, so you land in Hawaii. Let's just spend another minute on
No.
this because I really am interested in how if all that time, was spent not thinking about China, surely you get to Indo-PACOM and China is present.
Yep.
How are you thinking about it then? What is that
Yeah.
sort of, you know
I mean, so obviously I was a military officer at Pacific Command. My job is primarily to be sort of my title was as a crisis action planner. My job was to plan for those kinds of things that would be considered crises for, at the time, Pacific Command, which is obviously now called Indo-Pacific Command. But my job was primarily to provide for both the rear admiral that was the operations officer, but also the commander, the 4-star admiral that commands Pacific Command. My job was to be essentially the person that plans for how to respond to crises. And so a number of those things, like the sinking of the Chonan by the North Koreans, I helped plan the entire sort of U.S. military response for the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident in Japan. I spent quite a bit of time on North Korean interdiction planning, but also about the kinds of things we were seeing, whether it was actions against Japan in the Senkakus by
by
China,
China? Yeah.
or the other things that we were watching China begin to do during those years. I then, to get a sort of a broad appreciation of what was happening, and really got introduced to sort of the national level. So as a planner at Pacific Command, I began to interact with my counterparts in the State Department, at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Treasury Department, and other places, as we started to see sort of like the holistic picture of what our relationship was. But I was looking at it through the lens of sort of what is the U.S. military's role in that relationship, and so I got to see both the sort of the cooperation that we were doing, sort of the mill to mill cooperation, but also got to see all the planning and other things that we had to do to prepare for sort of worst case scenarios. Because obviously for Pacific Command, the third Taiwan trade crisis was not that far removed from their memories, right? For many of those, many of the folks that served in that command, certainly they remember 1995, 1996, and could see that those are things that could pop up again, as well as the EP3 crisis that had happened in April of 2001. Those were all very real things for that command, and I got exposed to it really for the first time as someone who had been serving in Europe and the Middle East before that.
Right. And it would seem that sort of always dealing with crises, right? You're always trying to think ahead about what could emerge that would be bad. That also would give you some sort of a certain kind of lens. But as you say, you also had some engagement element and sort of the mill to mill relationship and helping that, develop. So you mentioned the pivot and Hillary Clinton, and the pivot to Asia, I think, was an important inflection point in U.S. policy toward China, really. It was a recognition that Asia mattered and we weren't spending enough time in the fastest growing, most dynamic part of the world. But it was also, I think, there was an element of it that was clearly designed to ensure that, we remained present and, China didn't somehow become the dominant power in the region, which it looked like it was increasingly interested in doing. So looking, you are one of the few people I know that actually had quite senior positions in both the Obama and Trump administrations. If you were to look back to those two administrations and say now, you know, what would you take away from, either on the positive side or the negative side, either operationally or substantively from those administrations that you would like to bring forward to the current administration? What should they like take away from history as you are an historian? From the
Yep.
recent history, what would be most important, do you think, for them to be thinking about?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, a little context. I mean, I went from that time out at Pacific Command, which, yeah, I'm a relatively junior to mid-level officer, but I then moved back to the Pentagon right after that and essentially take over, a position on the Joint Staff that sort of runs China strategy for the Joint Staff for the chairman and the vice chairman, and then working for Deputy Secretary Bob Work and others on defense innovation. And defense innovation is obviously also directed at the fact that you have a technologically advanced China that is beginning to challenge us in a number of different domains. And so that whole process, and so I got to see for sort of the second term of the Obama administration from the Pentagon, working with the National Security Council and that team, I got to see how at a national level we were beginning to wrestle with that. And so I saw that entire sort of second half of the Obama administration, and then went into the Trump administration and really helped run that those sets of policies from the National Security Council around China. And I guess my big takeaway is that from a sort of a policy wise, we had a strategy of how we wanted to deal with Beijing. We had that strategy sort of in place, at least in my opinion, from sort of like May of 1994 when President Clinton's speech, I think at John Hopkins, sort of announces sort of an idea that we're going to pursue a policy of economic, helping the Chinese economy develop, and the expectation is we'll see sort of economic and political liberalization over time. Like that was sort of our approach, and so our economic departments and agencies had, I think, a very clear mandate from that point in time through the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, clear mandate to help the Chinese economy develop, become more enmeshed and bind it to the international system. And the Department of Defense and the intelligence community had a job to hedge against risk, right? That fundamentally there was an understanding that obviously things might not go right and there could be real tensions and dangers inside the relationship. And so the Defense Department and the intelligence community and the State Department are directed to hedge against that risk, right? And so that sort of balanced approach. But by the end of the Obama administration, and then as the Trump administration comes in, a realization that we're not seeing. I mean, certainly our strategy around helping the Chinese economy develop had worked extremely well, right? But we were not seeing the kinds of liberalizations. In fact, we're seeing the backsliding, right? I mean, this is 4 years into, so the last year of the Obama administration is essentially 3 or 4 years into Xi Jinping's rule, and we're beginning to see, I think, a very clear outline of the kind of ruler that Xi Jinping would be. And it's not the liberalizing reformer that many of us, I think, had hoped, right, that we had an expectation to see. And what we see is a really a deep backsliding, and sort of refusal to carry out the kinds of changes that somebody like Robert Zoellick had announced and sort of laid out in his responsible stakeholder speech back in 2005, right? So you have this I think a deep realization inside the Obama administration that things are not heading in the right direction. We're going to have to start to recalibrate. And then when the Trump administration comes in, there's an agreement with that and an implementation of a strategy that had its roots in the Obama administration and was likely to be the kind of strategy that that a President Clinton would have put in place, right? This is and her
Parts
people
of it, I
and
think. Yeah, parts
people
of it.
like Kurt
Certainly.
Campbell and
Right.
Jake Sullivan and Laura Rosenberger, all of those folks would have been in those positions.
Right.
Um, and it ends up being that the Trump administration implements a more a competitive strategy, one of viewing Beijing as a rival and a competitor, not as a partner. And that's that shift. Um, my opinion is that um, when it became clear, I think across the U.S. government that was the case, really by the end of 2015, the U.S. government moved relatively quickly in changing its strategy, right? Certainly by the end of 2017, you have a national security strategy that very clearly lays out that we view China as a competitor, and therefore we should treat them that way. And that I think has gone on. I mean, so that's within the China sort of watching community. that has remained up for debate. But I think within the broader sort of policy community, that became fairly clear early on. And then the problem is then how do you implement that? Um, and I think that's what both the Trump administration and then the Biden administration really had challenges of not dealing not only not the so I think the national security side, the defense side, understood their job was to continue to hedge against risk. But really, the economic departments and agencies really tough time adjusting to a shift from helping the Chinese economy develop to one that is like not helping them, right? And that's been a difficult transition, I think, for folks on the economic side, and then all the constituencies that fall underneath that.
Yeah, I mean, I might take a little bit of issue with that, having served in the Commerce Department during the Biden administration for a few years. I think it wasn't that the administration was looking to help the Chinese economy develop anymore. It was how do we balance our economic and our security interests, or how do we integrate them most effectively? Where do we draw the line around what constitutes national security? Or, is it okay for Starbucks to sell lattes and Nike to sell
Right.
sneakers? And so I
Or
think
okay for
those are
India to sell chips, right? I mean, all those
right.
debates
Those
and
are the big debates. But I guess what I'm asking you is, with all of that history right behind us now, is there something in particular that you think this Trump 2 administration should be maybe taking away that it isn't?
yeah, I mean, I felt that sort of the most important thing, the thing, like sort of the starting point is you had to have a declaratory policy that could allow for those sorts of shifts to happen. And and we've now, I think, had that. We had that from the early portion of the Trump administration. It was very clear that the Biden administration came in and had a declaratory policy that would see Beijing as a competitor, as a rival, and it would treat it as such. And and so that's extremely necessary because it sets the baseline then for departments and agencies to figure out how and what they're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis, right? If you don't have that, those discussions that you just discussed, yeah, obviously the Trump administration had those same challenges internally of trying to figure out where the right balance is, but without that declaratory policy to start with, really hard to get that sort of moving, because then you sort of relitigate whether or not they're a competitor or not, right? And so that's where you sort of find yourself. I think from a policy side, it's a really tough thing. And so for the Trump administration, I think they need to be able to continue to press that forward, have a clear understanding of what they're trying to do, and then enable departments and agencies to come up with those things that fit with the overall policy, right? Rather than a sort of a micromanagement of what it is, but allow those departments and agencies to use their authorities to figure out how best they accomplish those goals. And I think we see some of that going on within within the departments and agencies now. Both the America First trade policy and the America First investment policy have laid out some clear guidelines of what departments and agencies are supposed to do to come back with things for the administration to be able to execute on.
Right. So I guess to that end, we'll see more, perhaps, of a coherent and cohesive strategy after April 1st, I think is the
Yep.
date they're supposed
Yeah.
to be back with that. But one of the things that I really admired in your Substack, which, as I said, is really, I think, one of the best out there,
Appreciate
is
it.
that you are neither a Trump critic or a Trump supporter. I think you have become, in my mind, a little bit of the explainer in chief, right? Because I think for those of us, on the outside, it's often difficult to make sense of where the administration might be going. What we've seen, I think, of China policy to date has been, primarily through the lens of tariffs, right? So, the first, one set of tariffs in February, another set of tariffs in March. But you make the case, and I think quite convincingly in one of your recent pieces, that of course President Trump wants a deal, and that is what he's driving toward. And then the question, I think, becomes, well, what are the parameters of that deal? What do you think that deal actually looks like? What are we looking for? What do the Chinese want? Where could we meet in the middle? How does that happen? So maybe you could lay out a little bit of that, because I do think that, um, I think you have a really important perspective that brings some coherence to, I think, what is for most of us just a completely incoherent policy
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't speak for the administration. I mean,
No, of
I've
course. And
observed
that's
the
why I
ones.
said at
Yep,
the
yep,
outset, you are
absolutely.
not
Yep.
you come across as neither a defender, supporter,
Or a
nor
cheerleader,
critic.
right? I mean, I'm trying to lay out what I think
Exactly.
is happening, and then we can make judgments about, success or failure and those sorts of things.
Right.
But I think it's it's clear to me that President Trump and his administration don't see this purely as a China only sort of thing, right? There is a global set of players, and the U.S. has to deal with a global set. You're never going to be able to sort of set aside that this is just a U.S. China deal. It's always within the context of everything else that is happening in the world, and therefore it has to be sort of thought about that way, all right? And so I think there's a tendency for those of us that sort of spend time on one country or one region to try and distill things down to just your area, like, and then hold everything else constant. But I've always felt that someone who was sort of an advisor on one area, I had to appreciate that the folks that I was working for had global portfolios, and those global portfolios pulled in all kinds of different directions. And so I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind, that this is a multiplayer game, and that there are simultaneously positive sum games happening, zero sum games happening, and non-zero sum games happening, right? So it isn't as if we get to choose one or the other. Those are all happening simultaneously. And so I think, from my reading of sort of the administration's uh, you efforts so far in this first sort of 50 days, is that they have certainly learned from their first term. It isn't as if they're coming in. This isn't spring of 2017. This is with all of the accumulated experience from that period of time, and they've come in with a game plan. And I think that game plan is, we would like to have a situation in which the trade balance between the United States and the PRC was balanced. But there's a deep skepticism that that's going to be achievable. I think the administration spent enormous amounts of energy trying to do that in the first term, and found that they had counterparts on the other side of the table who either were not negotiating in good faith, or were simply unable to accomplish the kinds of outcomes that the United States would find acceptable. And that sets us up for really a difficult, again, I think President Trump actually is committed and would like to have a fair deal between the United States and the PRC. But I suspect that he's deeply skeptical that the Chinese could actually do that. And therefore, he'll probably spend much more time with others, much more time negotiating with others, in ways to improve the U.S. position over time, with the understanding that Beijing is likely the biggest disruptor to global trade and economic system, and that the United States is probably best off settling things with other countries. And I think that's what we see in the style of negotiation.
Okay, so let me push you a little bit on that because I mean, if the argument is that we're better off, working with others before we, work on China, it seems that nowhere, in fact, do we actually have a positive sum game going, right? Not with our closest allies, either in, North America, certainly not in Europe. Asia is a little bit uneven, a little bit, teetering. It's not quite clear where we're going with our Asian allies at this point. Um, so I'm wondering, with the exception of Russia, right? And we can talk about this idea of a reverse Kissinger, right, in which the United States is ostensibly trying to, instead of, pulling China away from Russia, we're pulling Russia away from China to our advantage. We can talk about whether that's, even feasible or if that is what's going on. But I'm curious how you see all of these moves
Yeah.
actually leading to greater leverage for the United States
Yeah.
in its negotiations with China.
So I think, I mean, I think we should look very closely at the set of meetings that the president held with Prime Minister Modi as an example of what this looks like, right? So, in terms of sort of trade barriers and sort of unfair trade practices, certainly India falls in the same category as the PRC, right? But very early, within the first 4 weeks, Prime Minister Modi is invited to the Oval Office. They appear to have a very friendly and it appears to be a very sort of warm relationship between the two of them. That they've clearly communicated while President Trump was out of office. They had a close relationship during his first term. And they came to a set of agreements, it would appear, based upon the press conference and everything that was announced, is that they would work on addressing sort of key trade issues that are of deep interest to both sides. And that's what the trade team, right? And that trade team of Treasury, Commerce, USTR, Peter Navarro, and Kevin Hassett, that they're going to work on developing things and resolving things between the U.S.-India relationship in that way, right? I think that's pretty clear. I think we saw with Prime Minister Ishiba coming to Washington and meeting in the Oval a similar sort of set of dynamics that are happening. I think this idea of resolving things with others doesn't necessarily mean that the United States accepts the current situation and is simply friendly on all those things. I mean, obviously, what I think we're seeing with both Canada and Mexico is really a demand upon those two countries to take actions to prevent the Chinese from being able to use their markets as ways to get around the things that the United States has in place. I mean, this is the aluminum and steel tariffs that have gone in place, right? Both Canada and Mexico. I mean, Canadian aluminum is the biggest imports coming into the United States. It's not because Canada has a gigantic aluminum industry. It's because it's all transshipment from the world's greatest overproducer of steel and aluminum, which is China. Those things are highly tariffed coming into the United States. And unfortunately, the Canadian government has allowed those things to bypass and come through their market into the United States underneath that, right? And that's something that they're seeking to resolve. It's the exact same set of dynamics for the Europeans. This is not new. The Biden administration has been the Obama administration raised these issues with the Europeans and the Canadians, right? The massive overcapacity in China for steel and aluminum, the way that was doing harms to the United States. We would ask those countries to collaborate with us. They have chosen to this point not to collaborate with us because they fear retaliation from China, right? And that's the dynamic that I think is happening here. And they're going to continue to press, I think, to see those things. And we'll see how that comes out. But fundamentally, it's about to resolve those things, which ultimately isolate Beijing in the long run, right? That if the United States is able to resolve those issues, then that actually strengthens the U.S.'s position and is negotiating with China in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we expand it out a little bit, and we talk about President Trump's, discussions of withdrawing from NATO, though, and pulling ourselves out of various international institutions and arrangements, it seems to me, we're leaving the field open for China. We're not actually finding our way to constrain it because we're basically picking up our marbles and going home.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what you're describing, I think, may fit narrowly in the trade space. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure it does because I think China's also moved and is moving pretty aggressively to, develop other markets, in Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia. So it isn't as dependent on the EU, US. So I'm just
But those
wondering,
things
like, in
are unlikely. We should be very clear. There is no America-sized economy
no,
replacement,
true,
right?
absolutely.
I mean, there is no
There's no substitute
within
at this
foreseeable
point.
future, Africa will never replace even a fraction of what the United States consumes from China. There isn't really a Chinese economy that can operate really without access to Europe and the United States, right? I mean, it just doesn't work. There's not enough wealth across Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia to be able to consume the products that China produces and exports out into the world. So I think we should be very clear that you're right. They are absolutely trying to develop those things, but those things cannot be replacements to what the economic situation is between U.S. and China right now. And I think the president understands that. I think he views the U.S. market that's selling into the world's largest, wealthiest consumer market should be seen as a privilege, and that fundamentally that's the position we should be operating on, rather than the U.S. as a market of last resort, and that it's an obligation that Americans open up their markets to everyone. That's just a different entire worldview of how to view trade. I suspect that he believes that a number of those international institutions have been unable to enforce the rules and norms that folks say that they enforce, and that becomes, I think, a deep frustration, is that we talk about these rules working, but they're only observed in the breach. And this is, I think, the fundamental frustration, is that it isn't actually working. So therefore, the U.S. is sort of forced to move in directions that take these actions.
So is that Matt as explainer-in-chief, or is that Matt as defender-in-chief? I'm
Yeah.
curious only in thinking
Um,
about something like the World Health Organization, where, removing ourselves actually removes us from
yeah.
access to a lot of information, a lot of scientific sharing around things like pandemics that ultimately
Yeah.
undermine our own human security, I would argue.
Yeah.
Same true with the Paris Climate Accord, where if it's not working the way that we want it to work, one could argue that
Yeah.
it's better to stay in and push, for some form of reform.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think for the WHO, after SARS, we tried to institute a series of really transparency initiatives that would allow for the kind of knowledge and information trading that we had all hoped for. And we watched, I think, an utter collapse of that at the start of COVID, largely because the Chinese government absolutely refused to follow through on the rules that we had all set up, and in a set of institutions. And so, um, I guess there's sort of the Einstein definition of insanity, right? I mean, if you keep trying to do the same thing over and over again, accept a different result, I think I have a little bit of, and so I don't think that means that every international institution has not been able to accomplish this thing. But I think on the WHO, I think we have to ask very serious questions of whether or not this system actually works. Um, I'm deeply skeptical of the agreement that we made, in 2015 over the Paris Climate Agreement. I am personally deeply skeptical of, given the fact that we now have the Chinese economy, in 2024 produced more coal-fired power plants, brought more coal-fired power plants online than essentially the entire existing infrastructure of Europe. I mean, so like, if that's what the Paris Climate Agreement means, is that China is in compliance while it continues to exponentially increase its CO2 output. It it My personal thing is that probably isn't a very good deal. So I'm deeply skeptical of it. But obviously, I don't think the United States is going to leave from being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. So if we look at sort of the institutions that have some power and some things to be able to do, I think there are things that the U.S. is absolutely going to stay in. But there are other things that are no longer sort of fit for purpose. And so I'm sympathetic to those positions, and I think I understand why the administration is pushing back on those things. Um, and I think that it does require us to do a bit of a introspection about whether or not these international institutions can achieve the outcomes that we had laid out for them to do. Or
Yeah.
is it that actually it's a bilateral, like fundamentally, if you want to achieve these outcomes, you're actually going to have to negotiate bilateral things. And I think for the Biden administration, this is where we found ourselves on dual use export controls, right? So we have an international institution called the Wassenaar Arrangement. Unfortunately, we allowed the Russians into that. It requires unanimity to be able to pass rules. So therefore, we can't use the Wassenaar Arrangement in order to do dual use export controls against the Russians over their war in Ukraine. And so we had to negotiate bilateral, multilateral, minilateral arrangements outside of that international institution in order to deal with the problems that we had. Now, I completely agree with the Biden administration's approach on doing that. You had to do that. The existing institution simply fails to accomplish the thing, right? And I also think that it's probably appropriate for the Trump administration to do some of those things as well.
So I'll be watching and waiting, Matt, to see whether, in fact, the Trump administration makes new and bold efforts on the issue of climate change outside the Paris Climate
I
Accord,
would be surprised at that.
and the
I
same
would be
true
surprised.
on the global health front.
Yep.
So, if that in fact is the case, that we're withdrawing from these institutions because they're not effective or they're not realizing their objectives as quickly as we would like, and I think it's important to note
Yeah.
that
Well,
I
I think
agree with
Trump
you on
administration
China,
does
but by
not
20
prioritize.
China's
Yeah.
China's
Yeah.
China's agreement is that by 2030, right, its emissions peak and then it goes down. I'm not, and I agree that that was a poor bargain to strike at the outset, but I think the real issue is I don't believe that they're actually withdrawing from these institutions because they think they're not effective,
Fair enough.
right?
Obviously, reducing CO2 emissions is not the administration's priority, right? It obviously isn't. And of course, when administrations are elected, they get to choose what they prioritize and what they focus on, right? And
That's why,
I think that's it's very clear. I mean, it's not like they're saying that's what they're trying to do.
right?
We can see, like, they actually are not saying that's what they're
No,
prioritizing. So I
they're
think it's
saying
very
drill, baby, drill, if I recall, right?
right,
Yes.
right, because they think that energy security is an extremely important thing for the United States. And fundamentally, that's what is going to help, maintain, a set of allies to be able to provide for that, rather than becoming deeply dependent upon, various authoritarian regimes that are providing energy.
Yes. Well, we could have a much bigger and broader discussion. I was just at Sarah, the big energy conference down
Yep.
in Houston. We get a big discussion about the role of renewables and what more we could be doing in that space too. But let's pivot. I do want to talk a little bit about Taiwan, and I want to finish up on the whole Russia issue and China. So the President Trump has been non-committal on Taiwan. Obviously sort of opposite from President Biden, who 4 times said, I think to the dismay of many, that he would come to the defense of Taiwan without any sort of caveats attached to that. People thought that was maybe not the most appropriate thing. Some people liked it, some people didn't. But President Trump, his statements on Taiwan have been, to the effect of they stole our semiconductor technology. They should be contributing 10% of their GDP to defense. They should be paying us for defense. It's very hard to have a good sense for how he's looking at Taiwan. And he did, get TSMC to do a big investment beyond what a Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company had agreed to do under the Chips and Science Act. So what's your sense for where the administration's head is at when it comes to Taiwan?
Yeah. Um, my suspicion is that I think it's all true that what you've laid out of what the president has talked about in terms of Taiwan. I think we should also add in that I think the president's been very clear, that he does not want, or would certainly deeply object to, any use of military force to change the status quo. He deeply objects to that, and has made it, I think, that pretty clear to Xi Jinping that, we certainly do not expect, or would allow for that kind of military force to be used. Um,
Has he said that? I mean, I know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that
I mean,
in
I see that
couple of
within
months.
the broad context of ensuring that there is peace, and these kinds of attacks wouldn't happen under his rule, and he'll continue to push for that, right? So I think that, like, if we look at it from that perspective, right? This is not Xi Jinping. If you want to launch a war, that's good on me, right? It's no, I don't expect there to be any war. He's also continuously pushing, not only Taiwan to spend more on defense, but Japan to spend more on defense, and Australia to spend more on defense, and the Philippines to spend more on defense, right? Um, you know, One could conclude, right, similar to the ways in which President Trump pushed European allies to spend more money on their defense, that is not exactly a very friendly and beneficial outcome to the Russians or the Chinese, right? So I think we should place it in that context, that he is probably someone who wants to maintain sort of the status quo, right? Which strangely is sort of a little bit, sort of pre the 4 statements that President Biden had made about the right, sort of getting back to, we're
Right.
certainly not going to encourage the Taiwanese to do anything, but we also do not want to encourage Beijing to do anything, right? That we are okay with the status quo. And if you're looking at that through to Taiwan's lens, well, the status quo is, I think, not a bad outcome, right? I mean, the status quo right now is that Taiwan has de facto independence. It's able to operate and run its own democracy and economy, and those are the outcomes that I think the United States would welcome. I think President Trump understands that, has an understanding of that. Certainly, Xi Jinping uh, absolutely wants to affect what he would call reunification, right, and what I would call annexation, um, and that he is not interested in giving Xi Jinping the thing he most wants. I suspect that that's the dynamic. Um, but as he has said, we'll see what happens. But
Right.
I think that's the way it is. I mean, and certainly, um,
So a return to strategic ambiguity, basically.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's what he, that is probably his sort of default position on this, is that that's probably the way to approach this, um, while encouraging, right? So, I mean, if if the Taiwanese chose to increase their defense spending from about 2.5, 2.7% of GDP to 3 or 4% of GDP, I suspect that President Trump would absolutely welcome that and would open up U.S. defense sales to provide for those increases. Would welcome those actions. That's probably not what Xi Jinping would like to hear from President Trump.
So let me just take you back then one step, in terms of that sort of comprehensive deal of some form that you think President Trump might want to strike with the Chinese. My sense from reading some things about what the Chinese side has been thinking about is they would love to structure a deal that would include basically President Trump saying, U.S. hands off on Taiwan. You saw that however you see fit. So they're trying, to figure out what would it take to get President Trump to that point. You're saying you don't think President Trump would ever get to that point.
I think it'd be really difficult. I think President Trump understands, it's not like he hasn't heard that from the Chinese before, right? I mean, it's not like between 2017 and January 2021, Xi Jinping never brought up Taiwan.
No, never brought it up, but did they start to try to put things on the table that they thought would be so appealing to President Trump in some space or another that he would forsake Taiwan in some
I
way?
suspect that his position will be, um, you couldn't even do the phase one trade deal we made. You couldn't even follow through on that, right? Like, how can I trust you as a counterparty if you can't even follow through on the things that we agreed to in 2020? Um, why would I expect that you would follow through on a bunch of commitments to us if we compromised on this right now, right? And so I suspect from his perspective, it would be, once China can show, the United States and the rest of the world that it can follow through on its commitments and really fulfill the things that it has said it is going to do, well, that at some point in time in the future, we could have a discussion about other things, right? And I suspect that he's deeply skeptical that Beijing could ever do that within the time frame that would be meaningful for a deal that the two of them could get done. Hence the concentration on everybody else, right? Hence, that's why I spend time negotiating with the Indians. That's why you spend time negotiating with the Russians. That's why you spend time that's why you spend time on all those other things, because
Because the Russians are
probably
so easy and so good. So
well,
let's
well,
move
I
to the
suspect that
Russia.
he feels that he spent a lot of time really getting nowhere during his first term with Xi Jinping, right?
Right.
Uh, yeah, I mean, we were on the cusp of what he thought was a fairly good deal in
Right.
in May of 2019, where fundamentally had the Chinese sort of pursued that deal. That deal was essentially that China conduct the reforms that the Chinese had announced in November of 2013 at the Third
Right.
Plenary 18th Party Congress, right? Right. The reason why those were Liu He's reforms. Xi Jinping rejected those. Those were American changes. Those were the United States wanted China to fulfill its commitments that it made to the world years before.
Yeah, it was a last gasp effort by Liu He, right? It was a kind of a
That's right.
GOP
And it
type effort to get
and it
the
failed,
international community to
right?
help the reformers, put pressure on the leaders to do the right thing.
I suspect that on the American side, that hasn't been forgotten. right? Like that would be like the absolute minimum to start a period for us to be able to feel that there's enough trust for us to be able to have any other discussions.
Well, we know that's not going anywhere then.
Exactly.
So that just sounds like one long 4-year stalemate to me. But okay, let's talk. Let's just
Which is what I think is happening.
okay.
That's my prediction, is that fundamentally this is a stalemate.
Okay. Well, I guess that's good news for Taiwan because underneath everything you said, it sounded to me like you're not 100% certain that we couldn't trade away Taiwan in the future if President Trump believed that China would adhere to its agreements. But I'm not going to push you anymore on that. I'm just, the subtext of what you're saying. So, Russia, big play with Russia, this whole idea of a reverse Kissinger. Do you think that is what the administration is trying to accomplish? Do you think it's feasible that he could split Russia from China?
So, I mean, I think it's certainly something that, folks like Steve Bannon and others coming into the administration back in 2017 had in mind, right? That fundamentally that, um, if you allowed Beijing and Moscow to become closer and closer partners, and the United States had relatively weak and divided European partners, and you had other countries that weren't really capable of standing up and being a partner with the United States, that if you're talking about a great power triangle, it's a really bad position for the United States to be in is the odd man out. That fundamentally you need to sort of work your way out of that. And so that leaves you with sort of two options. Do you pull the Chinese away from the Russians, or do you pull the Russians away from the Chinese, right? And the obviously the approach that Nixon and Kissinger took is that you focus on the weaker of the two, because then you can offer them things in terms of compromises, which then sets them against the other. Now, of course, when Nixon and Kissinger did this, you already had a Sino-Soviet split,
Right.
right?
You had an interested party.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so
Yeah.
the added interested part. But again, I mean, it is not a given that within the sort of communist bloc that they would necessarily turn on each other to side with the United States, right? So I mean, it was a bit of a challenge there to figure out how to bring so Kissinger and Nixon deserve some credit there to figure out how to get that done. And so I think and I've written that I think the likelihood of its success is relatively low, but it is sort of the best of the worst options, right? So right now, I think for the United States, we don't have many good options, geopolitical options, right? So we don't like this situation where the war in Ukraine continues on, and we continue to have the threats of expansion and, both horizontal and vertically, right? Both, in terms of geographic expansion. I mean, anybody watching what's been happening in the Baltic Sea over the last 6 months should be deeply concerned, right? That fundamentally we could see an expansion, geographically of that conflict against NATO, and also a vertical escalation in terms of, up to higher weapons and things like that, right? So that there's a danger as that conflict goes on. So, I suspect that, just as and I laid out, Henry Kissinger's, remarks back in May of 2022 that fundamentally at some point in time,
Right.
we're going to try and figure out how to bring this conflict to an end. We don't want this to continue on. And that at that point in time, it is not as if Beijing and Moscow are permanent and perfectly aligned, allies that have identical interests, right? They have differences. There are things you can pull on. And so it is certainly not impossible for that to happen. It is going to be difficult. It will require real effort to be able to make that happen. But my sense is that there really aren't too many other better options. Some things that could have happened that maybe would have gotten us to a better position is, I mean, had our European allies taken February of 2022 much more seriously and actually had gotten themselves into a much better defensive position today than where they are, this might be a little bit easier. Like there might be some other options to this. That didn't happen, right? And it's unclear whether that will. Maybe Chancellor, soon to be Chancellor Merz will be able to do that in Germany. But I think there's a lot of question marks about whether or not the Germans can actually make that happen, and whether or not the Europeans can bring themselves together in a united fashion to be able to sort of strengthen themselves. So I'm deeply concerned about that. And then on the other side, unfortunately, we don't have particularly strong allies in other places, right? Certainly I think we're deeply aligned with the Japanese, but they don't have kind of the scale. And we should be very honest, we've got real political uncertainty in Tokyo. Prime Minister Ishiba is not in a particularly strong position. Once Prime Minister Abe was assassinated in the summer of 23, 22, it's been hard for the Japanese to put together really a leadership team that can really sort of lead on that side. And so the United States, I think, is a bit stuck, and it has to figure out what are the other options. And so again, I don't think this is not the option I would choose, but it's probably an option that is plausible. And it really has to do then with what can actually get negotiated, right? So it remains to be seen. The one thing I would say is that, if the outcome is that the United States is going to do a degree of a compromise on Ukraine, that's something that the United States can negotiate with Moscow in ways that Moscow can't get that from Beijing, right? So if that's what Putin really wants, that is something the United States can negotiate on. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but that is sort of that's the reality of how it looks. And that could create a situation where the United States is able to do some things. And that would be really problematic for Beijing. And I think that it's one of their fundamental fears is being sort of isolated in this, which may bring us to a position where we can have a real negotiation with Beijing about, how much do they push on countries around them and act in ways that are disruptive to a global system.
Okay, I put the odds of that happening at, I don't know, if there's a number less than 0 in an odd, I'd put it there. I'd put it there, but let's reconvene
Yep.
in a few months, Matt, because in fact I didn't get to ask you most of the questions around economic security and technology that you are so fluent and so good in. So I want to have you back for that whole second discussion.
Well, I look forward to it. It'll be
And we
fun.
can then assess,
Yep. Yep.
what's
It
transpired
it
in the first
deserves
6 months.
deserves a close watch. I think there is no guarantee, but it appears that is what the administration is trying to do.
Agreed. That is what they are trying to do.
Yep.
Okay, I always finish up with a couple of quick questions, just to get your take. First, what would be your must-read book or article on China that you would recommend?
I really like um, Xi Jinping Thought, Stephen Zhang, and
Uh, Love that book.
yes,
Olivia Chung.
I think
Yep,
I think they did a really good job with it.
agreed.
It they've sourced it really well, and I'm really impressed. I have on my desk Kevin Rudd's book on it too. I suspect that one is equally good. I just have not made it through it yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can read my review of it in the next issue of
Oh,
Foreign.
excellent,
You know,
excellent,
it is a great book, but as I say, it's not for the faint of heart. So,
good. Yeah. Well, I am a bit of geek on these things, so
yeah, you can definitely make it through.
it'll be good. Yeah.
Okay, so, Steve John's book, 100% agree. What China issue do you think we don't know enough about? What's
Um,
understudied in our field?
yeah. You know, my sense is that um, there is a lot that's said that we don't understand. I actually think we do understand China relatively well. I think we have an understanding of their system. I think we have to look at it through a lens of sort of a Leninist political system and sort of get back to this knowledge of how do Leninist systems operate, right? And this goes back to the book, The Organizational Weapon, sort of written in the 1950s, that sort of examines how Leninist political systems operate. Like, what is the way, how do they use organization? How do they use party structures to get things accomplished? And I think that would provide us a lot more insight into how Xi Jinping is setting up the party, right? Now that wasn't the case, right, 15 years ago, right? Because we were living in under a sort of a different China. But I think Xi Jinping definitely moved the party in that direction, right? He's moved it to a much more sort of political Leninism than what it was before. And those are that's terminology that many of us thought we should have flushed out, 4 decades ago, and we didn't have to worry about anymore.
Okay, last one. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest likelihood, what are the odds not of a reverse Kissinger, but of a Nixon-Mao moment in the U.S.-China relationship within the next decade?
Um, I think it's so 1 being the least likely.
1 being the least likely. Mhm.
Yeah, it's probably a 1 or 2. And I think it's just sort of the dynamics of sort of the sort of the geopolitical landscape. Um, you know, again, we made that agreement because they were the lesser of the rivals, right? And so, um, you don't make those kinds of agreements with your primary rival. So I think it's unlikely because I think from both the United States and the PRC, each thinks that it needs to get itself in a position, um, to gain an advantage over the other. And so it's unlikely that we're going to come to some sort of grand bargain.
Maybe we'll have a massive shift in leadership in the PRC that will surprise us
Maybe,
all in a
maybe. I
positive
mean, obviously, Xi Jinping will not live
yes.
forever, right?
No, right.
And
On
so
that we can count, yes.
that's right. And in leadership transitions, there are always opportunities
Right.
to figure out what can be done. And I think certainly the PRC understands that about the United States. It starts off each in many ways it starts each new administration off with looking for ways to change things, and we should look at it the same way. We just haven't had that now for a dozen years.
Right. Right. And we're probably not gonna have it for another 7 or so. So
Right.
so
But,
we're
I mean,
no point
he's in
holding
his
our
early
breath.
70s, right? I mean, statistically, we're getting into those ranges where, there is a non-zero chance that, that this, he passes away naturally in the next few years. I mean, that like, it
Well,
is it is certainly
I
possible.
don't know, Matt, he'll be, 78 at the end of
He'll
his
be
at the end of a 4th 5-year term, and,
Yep,
that's young for, if you
that's
were in our
for today's
society,
leaders, that's young.
he's spring
Yes.
chicken.
Um,
So
but again, people get he's lived in a society where there's probably a lot of smoking and, you can imagine. I mean, it is certainly possible. I mean,
it's all
look at just happened to his old premier.
oh, that was
So,
very sad, actually.
yes.
It's like there were one person I would have liked to have seen lead the country instead of Xi Jinping, it would have been Li Keqiang.
Yep.
On that note, let me thank you so much for taking the time, to
Thanks,
speak with
Liz.
us. I think it was a really, rich and substantive discussion, gave an enormous amount of food for thought. So thank you, and I hope you'll come back on, in another, 4 or 5 months to do an
Yep.
assessment of what we got right, what we got wrong.
Yep. And I could certainly be wrong in all of this. So thank you, Liz. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more reasoned discourse and debate on China, I encourage you to subscribe to China Considered via the Hoover Institution YouTube channel or podcast platform of your choice.